What I would like to reflect on is our research insights that we've gathered here at Oxford about infrastructure procurement, its management, and under the big umbrella of cost containment and cost control and cost risk. And this is of particular great interest to me because one of the key things that we've done here at Oxford in the last, I forgot now, 13, 14 years is to not only look at transport infrastructure where we started, but actually look across different sectors. So here you see that this hasn't been published yet. So there's a couple of publications that are going through the usual process that will make these numbers public domain knowledge. So for now, you've got the slide and the very first look about what it actually looks like. What you see here on this slide is a snapshot of this big database where we now have more than 16,000 projects where we track the cost evolution through the front-end process. So from the typical stages of strategic case to outline case to final investment decision, and then compare those ex-risk against the actual outturn cost. So a classic ex-post versus ex-ante study. The interesting thing that we see here, so here you see a couple of those picked out, and it's not completely random what I picked out here. So it is the very best by the mean cost overrun. So the mean cost overrun is in the first row here that you see. The frequency of having a cost overrun of any size, that's the second row. Then there's the mean schedule overrun, the mean benefits overrun, which means that a negative number here, as you see, is the case for all of these projects where data are available. A negative number means there's a shortfall. So in transport infrastructure, because that's the most comparable measure, that means passenger or vehicle numbers per day and compared to the plan. And then you see there the final cost, final row has something that is subject to some of our most recent publications, which is how often do these projects turn into statistical outliers, or to use a popular term for that, black swans, which in this case is anything that has cost overruns of 88% or greater compared to FID. So that pretty much double its cost. So extreme events that shouldn't be there. And what you see here is some of the very best capital investment projects you can do. Solar power, on average, or the mean, is 1% cost overrun, 2% schedule delay. And then you see on the right-hand side some of the worst things you can do. So the worst project category, and I know it's not particular part of this audience here, but you might be tangentially impacted by this because it might happen in your state, and we're burning a lot of taxpayers' money at the moment, is to find storage location for nuclear waste, where we see on the mean overrun is 238% with 70% delay for these projects. And there's also quite a large benefit shortfall in terms of usable capacity at the end of it. And to some extent, you can see in that, the classic idea, sort of the classic transport infrastructures like roads, rail, that sits somewhere sort of at the lower end or on the left-hand side of this chart. So roads not as risky as rail, yet on average in both of these cases, we do see sort of in rail, particularly around 40% cost overrun on average. Schedule overruns around 30 to 40%, as you can see here, and also some sizable benefit shortfalls. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight here is particularly one thing that I don't know if it worries me, but I find particularly interesting as a rich research ground is digital stuff, what we call here IT-led change, and whether that is the change that is then driven because an owner-operator might digitize processes and systems used internally and the way they operate assets, or it is actually having an effect on how users are using these assets. Think smart motorways, think different tolling systems and different ways of, if I these days say charging for traffic, that sometimes charging for traffic than charging traffic, if you anyway, so there's a lot of more IT in our projects that are coming online. So that kind of big push towards digitization as you can see here, in particular when we're talking about road infrastructure, actually adds a whole chunk of uncertainty and risk to what we are procuring. And I find that super interesting. Now, from our research perspective, how we look at this, we typically chunk projects up into what happens during the planning process and what happens afterwards in procurement and then execution. So what happens before the final investment decision, we can almost summarize around these things. So all of these projects, no matter what industry, what sector, make promises, typically around the three key characteristics of any NPV calculation, which is cost, time, and benefits. And if we're asking the question, right, you might say, even in road, even in rail, right, 40% over here, 40% under there, happens in 60% of the case, 70% of the cases. If you look across the board, how good are we at making these promises when it comes to the investment decision? We see here that about 1 and 2 of those decisions then deliver against the promised cost estimate. So half of the projects are delivering on budget or better. We're then also asking the question, how many did not only deliver on budget or better, but also on time or earlier? Then it's about 1 in 12. And when we're asking the question, okay, how many of these projects have also delivered not only on budget or better, on time or better, but also on benefits or better, then we're in the space of 1 in 200. My colleague Bent Flubier, who's probably a household name in this beautiful audience, has called this a long time ago the Iron Law of Megaprojects, that projects are over budget, over time, and under benefits over and over again. Or you could flip that around and simply saying, it is just showing how hard it is to get the uncertainty right. And I think Shoshana's paper just now showing us in sort of how we can adjust options to better deal with that uncertainty, because getting that uncertainty right, understanding it right, and finding a better split of where do we place that uncertainty in the market, in the supply chain, on the owner-operator side, on the financing side of things, that has big implications on how we can improve project delivery. So the way we look at it and the way what we see here is, and what I want to split out, is kind of in these two elements of it. So first of all, what can we do upfront when we are having sort of in our planning capability? And I would say there it's a lot about our decision quality. So how can we get decision quality up on that side of things? And then thinking very simplistically about projects, I know this might be a gross oversimplification of what happens if you have billions to invest or millions to spend, then it is all about value control. And that has to do with our execution, that has to do with our procurement and commercial management of cost containment. So I'd like to unpack these two dimensions. Now, what we see here is some of the particular front-end consideration when we're talking about decision quality at entry. So why are we underestimating uncertainty? And that auction model was very driven by, understanding true ranges of uncertainty, the level of uncertainty, the level of standard deviation, and these kind of things is really important. And if you followed our research, you will know that, and you've seen that before, the data actually show a systematic bias towards underestimation, individually in each of these dimensions when we're taking cost, schedule, and benefits, but also collectively. So just show 1 in 200 projects, that is more than an error. There's a systematic bias in the data, which then leaves the question to these kind of, how do we bring behavioral economics into the game through the great work that Kahneman and Tversky and everybody else after that have done around decision-making biases. And the second question around the great work that Martin Wax has done a while ago on, actually the way we are procuring things, with the way we are awarding work, the way we're setting budgets within government departments, that is creating incentives where we get very rational responses, where we want to underreport true cost, and we want to misrepresent or underrepresent the true uncertainty in our projects. Now, when we're faced with this kind of model, what do we do? And so I did a thing where I went out and asked some of the leaders of these capital projects. And this is a UK sample, so I asked these people who look after things that in the UK context are bigger than 25 million, so they're classified across government in the UK as major projects. There's about 100 at any given point in time. So as you know, as in our economy is a little bit smaller, our ambition is a little bit smaller than in the US. And I asked 240 of these projects leaders, which of these biases has most impacted your project? And you can see here, the biggest one is optimism. So being optimistic, having that overconfidence in the supply chains that we're procuring, in the deliverability of the projects, that is 25%, a quarter of the respondents said, and that's actually what has impacted us the most. And then the second one, 14%, they talk about as the biggest detriment to their project has been that self-interest, that political bias, that is not that unforced optimism, that unforced overconfidence, great level of ambition, but actually a very rational response to the incentives we set in the budgeting process. And you see here, there's a couple of other projects there that have been negatively affected. And one of the interesting things, thinking about this is a list from the behavioral economists, actually is around the effect heuristic, where you find that projects are falling in love, or the people doing the projects are falling in love with their project. And is a particular thing in the public sector, I found, and particularly when we're talking about decarbonization projects, whether they are in the transport sector, whether in the energy sector, the housing sector, etc. Almost nobody doesn't, we all know that is a big issue. So it's very hard to stop these projects when they're going awry. Now, looking at the second side of things, when we're talking about value control, and this is coming sort of from our procurement angle, and what has procurement to do with this, right? So there's one element about the decision quality at entry, and how well do we actually understand, how well do owner-operators understand the risks they are trying to then manage, place in the market, mitigate, transfer, etc., commercially or through other processes. But way too often, and that is, I think, true in every single jurisdictions we're looking at, we're seeing this kind of picture that we're throwing risks over the fence and trying to place them with whoever's being able to carry them, and assuming often that these risks have been mitigated. That kind of, oh yeah, I'm glad that that hole is not on our end. And in particular, and I really like the previous talk around this, and how can we get better at the bidding? How can we move away from the fixed price lump sum auction kind of suggestion, which are always, and I think it's just here in the first sentence there's, and that it's unwise to pay too much, but it's even worse to pay too little. Because if you pay too little, you might end up with nothing at all. To paraphrase this quote that has actually completely unknown origins, but typically attributed to John Ruskin, a member of, well, sort of an early sort of economist, arts and craft person. And where we see this this going is actually sort of some of our insights, and where we have looked at these things is in terms of when we're looking at procurement models and when we're talking to people who are making strategic procurement decision about the avenues of procurement to go down to, there's often a little bit of a confusion about what are we actually procuring. And I found this kind of categorization and thinking quite helpful to think about is then, are we at the low end of the scale where we're actually procuring something that's relatively low risk, a product? I like that example of traffic cones, right? Let's procure a bunch of traffic cones, right? There's a product, we're placing an order, somebody will deliver that order, it's relatively little uncertainty. Then the second step up is where in the markets we actually want to form a project around providing an integrated solution. So this is multiple products that need to come together, a higher risk of uncertainty. We're actually starting our journey into the design, procurement, and decision-making around the explication of user needs. And we then want to procure against those user needs, and we're open to different technical solutions. The next level up is we want to go on somewhat of an innovation journey together, And so we really want to procure insights and ideas. We want to procure novel innovation. Again, a greater level of uncertainty, a greater level of risk. And that actually requires often long-standing relationships, something sort of from this space onward that public sector is typically not very good at procuring, because it requires that long-term collaboration. And then the top half, the very top one there, is where we really want to procure partnership. So the classic PPP model, where PPPs we know always fail when there's too much risk involved, but actually we want to really create a shared business understanding, and we want to procure and enter into strategic partnerships with our suppliers in the supply chain about procuring some of those. Now, so you can imagine that I find this particularly helpful to ask the question, particularly to owner-operators, of do you know what you're procuring? Therefore, do you know what the risk is involved and what that then means for your procurement strategy and different types of procurement? Because you can get it wrong. To be on the top right-hand side, and I think this chart might be a little bit unhelpful because, you know, I'm from a business school, so the top right corner is always the best. So what we see there is that building those kind of relationships, having those key suppliers in your ecosystem, that is a lot of work, that is a lot of bandwidth. Where on the other side, if it's just a product, it's just a product. Traffic cones, it's just a traffic cone, right? So, and similarly for suppliers in the supply chain, you can make good money in any of these configurations. And the worst thing is if you're trying to create or sort of look at a level of uncertainty and your relationship and sort of your approach to that kind of procurement isn't aligned with that, or you might be over-investing in terms of sales, even sort of in the way we're going through procurement exercises, you might be over-investing in what you're doing. Say, for instance, in Australia, I've recently seen, because of doing some work and research there, standard part and parcel of a lot of that kind of partnership style alliancing procurement is almost HR assessment center styles behavioral interviews, where of a joint venture, the leadership of the joint venture, the operational leadership of the future joint venture needs to come in and goes through war games and scenarios. And each of the shortlisted bidders goes through these scenarios, and it takes a week. So they come in for 3 full days. They're not allowed to bring any lawyers, just for the client to then select the people that they think as a JV have figured out how to work together and how to make decisions together. So a massive amount of investment there in the procurement thing, when on the left-hand side in the transactional space, you would have much leaner, much meaner procurement processes, much more focused on different elements than, say, for instance, ability to jointly solve problems. In our recent case studies, and this is very much driven by looking into what's happening in the world in Singapore, Hong Kong, the UK, and Australia. So this is where we drew our case studies from, particularly looking around this and sort of how do projects create value, and how do procurement and commercial arrangement create values. Here's a couple of those success factors that we see in terms of what does successful partnering look like when we're in that space where we want to share risk, where we might not even fully understand the total value of risk, but have to explore that space together with our suppliers. And this whole divide between, you know, here's one side of the contract, here's another side of the contract becomes a lot less murky and diverse. And one of the things here is that I kind of, you know, you see these things and often, well, the punchline is it's actually about relationships. So the contractual form, the commercial form that you're creating is sort of underlying that, is building the foundation, or providing sort of a basic cushion, but it's not the foundation. So you have to have that relationship, particularly that trust between contracting parties, the shared framework of values established first, and then that becomes sort of the guiding thought and the guiding principles by which you're executing the spirit of the contract rather than the words of the contracts. And that is very interesting. And also, like, to really point out here's the point 3 and 4 on my list, which is the particular question about risk. Ultimately, risk, particularly once you are differentiating between risk and uncertainties and the liabilities for that, often the liabilities flow back to the client and the owner operator, the principle of the contractual arrangements. And that comes often also with a lot of responsibilities. We do see that in many jurisdictions, many clients placing more contracts where they are taking more of the role of the active system integrators, and we're seeing the typical procurement of going with big turnkey contracts that being diminished, also driven by market developments in the last 5 years, where we do see that if you want to place a lot of risk into the markets, the risk carrying capability of a lot of engineering construction company isn't that great anymore. And projects at particularly big size carry a lot of risk. And you, other than the Bechtels of this world, you find very, very few companies who have a balance sheet large enough to really carry large amounts of risk. So there are some of those things. If you place this in sort of the wider research, and I always like to highlight this because this comes from sort of some folks who whose research we often don't particularly look at as economists, because we like to things ex post, ex ante, and then define our baselines, but what actually happens in between. So this is a study from my adaptation of a study from Giuliano Denicola at University College London, who has basically done a lot of the literature review, very systematic literature review on anything that we know about major large-scale construction projects and the success and failures of those. And this is kind of a systems of systems analysis. And as I just said, is in sort of what our research shows is really that a lot about is that decision-making quality at entry. And we in particular found a very fruitful ground to explore the behavioral economics side of these things. But I do think when we're thinking about future research, there is a lot more to be done in terms of trust, in terms of relationship, and the relationship between contracting parties that remains to be explored. In our world, we often look at sort of what are good contracting approaches, good contracting models. So there's a question here for me is, and how does that fit in with wider strategic considerations? So more of the operational strategy, strategic consideration, organizational development, strategic consideration of owner operators. So how does that fit together? I think we talked enough about risk and uncertainty and how we can think about allocations, sharing, mitigations, but also thinking differently about, on the one hand, that liability and the actual managerial. So on the one side here, we have liability consideration. On the other side, we have active risk mitigations, what we can do about that. And then, of course, you see some of the other things, which is a big element around politics. We know that politics exists. I'm seeing kind of very exciting research coming out of stakeholder management and engagement consideration. And then there's, of course, something that when we're talking to suppliers and the construction industry, what they're particularly interested in is around, so how can we get more into the space of, excuse my bad drawing on this little chart here, around manufacturing, more digitization, better systems integration, upskilling, more innovations around the programmatic tools and the systems we use and the procedures that are placed once we're in contract, but also some of the commercials that govern how the supply chain itself work together, particularly around that element of system integration and how we see changes in the role of the owner operator and the system integrator. So that's what I kind of wanted to leave you with as a summary. When I look at the research and when we look at the research here, there's a lot of work that has been done. There's a lot more work to be done in terms of how can we get that decision quality at entry up. We know that the psychologists have been really great of raising the awareness of some of those decision traps, have provided us with great checklists. There's great power in data, and as economists, we're really good at data. And so there's great power and data to help with that. And then when we're looking at the value control, what happens after final investment decision, in my oversimplified model, no offense, Dejan, is then around as in sort of what can we see when we're thinking about procurement in a broader consideration than just cost. So what we're seeing at the moment, big trends towards sustainability, procuring for value, procuring for behaviors, and also then how we deal with risk and uncertainties in these kind of different settings. I think there's a lot of conundrum still to be solved.